So a fab woman I know called Victoria, who publishes books, asked me to write a short story for this book, which is called Women's Stories, Women's Voices. And I thought this is a great opportunity to get round to writing a little bit of my mum's story. My mum was adopted as a baby when her mum died of TB in the 1930s. And my mum spent a huge part of her adult life trying to trace to find birth family. And there were so many dead ends, so many things that didn't bring up any information at all. And then there was a breakthrough, mostly because of the internet. When Mum was in her 60s, she finally found family. And I wanted to capture that in a story, and I want to read that story to you now. I called it, Who Am I? There's something about seeing your mum cry, whatever age you are, that makes everything seem all wrong. The strong, responsible gatekeeper who protects you from all the world's ills has gone off duty. Anything could happen. I was in my 20s when I saw my mum cry like never before. She became so childlike and so scared that I thought we both would break. She was trying to explain to me that she didn't know who she was and that she felt like an alien dropped from the skies, neither connected nor, most importantly, belonging to anyone or anywhere. It sounds like a story of mental illness, and I suppose in some way it was, but it's really a story of emotional pain and a sequence of events that neither me nor my brother had a clue about. My mum was born in Preston in Lancashire, and later my grandparents moved to Derby where she grew up. Only here she was, telling me through a flood of heart-racking tears that she was born in Manchester. And those grandparents? They're not your grandparents. I'd unknowingly prompted my mum's sharing of her story by asking the simple question, if you could have anything for Christmas that money can't buy, what special thing could I make happen for you? It was days before I managed to piece the whole story together from various fragments of information. Her single Irish mother dying of TB shortly after giving birth to her, and the people I thought were my grandparents arriving at a Catholic nursing home to adopt a curly blonde-haired girl, only for my dark-haired mum to raise her arms from her cot, eager to be chosen instead. When my mum got married, her adoptive parents gave her all the information they had. It amounted to a birth certificate and an adoption certificate. All she knew about her past was that her birth mum had given her the name Margaret, and she was Catholic. And to this day, Mum really doesn't like anyone to shorten her name. Margaret is the name her mum gave her, and for a long time, that name was all she had of her mum. In this moment though, as she was telling me the story, her tears were driven by fear. Fear that once I knew the truth, I wouldn't love her anymore. My mum had lived for over 60 years believing that being adopted was something shameful to hide away. She'd also spent the last 20 years searching on and off for a blood relation of some kind, an anchor to the real world. Proof that she really was someone. She needed her people. I remember her saying that finding someone would be incredible, but that the one thing she wanted, more than anything, the answer to my question of the perfect Christmas present, was a photo of her mum. Proof of belonging and a connection to her real past. At this point, she still daren't tell my brother and swore me to secrecy because of her fear of rejection. So we set off as a dynamic duo to reignite her search for family, an adventure that was both exciting and laborious in equal measure. In the olden days of the 1990s, family records were all about microfiche machines, minuscule text on rolls and rolls of plastic film viewed through a magnifying screen, ad nauseum. No search engine, not even a way to search a particular word or name. Coincidentally, I was working in Manchester at the time, and we set off to sit in the archives of the city where Mum had been born, apparently in a sewing machine shop, long since demolished. Every time we'd set off with so much energy and enthusiasm, really optimistic. Each trip would end with us exhausted. So many dead ends with a whole bundle of, well, perhaps it was more this way and perhaps it happened like this. Stories that we made up, trying desperately to piece together some kind of coherent sequence of events with virtually no information other than Mum's birth certificate and a baptism notice. Over the years, we ebbed and flowed, every now and again having another burst of trying to find something, someone, and then Mum had a breakthrough. She uncovered her mum's death certificate. The details showed Leeds as the place of death, a cemetery just out of the city. Dad drove her up and she was lucky to find staff in the office and a big handwritten book detailing all the names and dates of everyone in the graveyard. Mum gave her mum's name and date of death and waited. And then came the news. Yes, that's her. Mum fell against the wall, repeating, "I can't believe she's here. I can't believe she's here." But there it was, her name written into the book in 1938, and a short walk from the office, and she was at the grave of her real mum, and a dozen other adults and children. The tuberculosis epidemic was so severe that people were buried several to a grave, but there, listed on the leaning headstone, was her mum's name. Died of TB, aged 26. Now in her 60s, after surviving 2 bouts of cancer, my mum had found her mum and a place to come to for at least some kind of connection. If there's one thing true about my mum, she doesn't mess about when she's got the bit between her teeth, and she was quick to ask the cemetery about the actual place of death. Her mum died in a specialist hospital for people with TB right next door to the graveyard. She went straight round, and though it was by this time closed to patients, a fabulous caretaker, one of the few members of staff tasked with winding down the whole building, allowed them inside, and soon they found themselves standing in the ward where my grandma, I suddenly realised she's just my grandma, would have stayed. It was Art Deco, wide curved room with an entire wall of windows that looked out onto a balcony overlooking a beautiful tree-filled garden. And though it was autumn at this point, there were no blooms in sight. There was a long bed of roses underneath the balcony. The hospital would have been quite new then, and a world away from the Victorian design of most institutions at the time. The fresh air from the balcony, the breeze in the trees, and the scent of the roses wafting up would have been so beautiful. It was a huge moment for Mum, knowing she was standing in a room her mum had actually been in too. Later, in the archives in Leeds, we found a photograph of the opening of the hospital with a row of dignitaries proudly standing next to a flourishing bed of beautiful roses. I remember sharing the news with friends at the time, so pleased that there was some progress, at least something to help Mum feel like a real person. Little did we know then, this wasn't the end of the story. A few years went by, and every now and again we'd pop up to the cemetery to plant flowers and clear the weeds. I painted the engraving of my grandma's name in so it stood out in the long list. It seems strange now to write my grandma. It was such a long time before I cottoned on to the fact that this wasn't just Mum's search, but mine too. We saw things change over time. In fact, it was less than a year after Mum and Dad stood in that TB ward looking out at the trees that both the hospital and the trees made way for a housing estate, and all the history was gone. Enter the computer age, and the biggest single shift in anyone's search for family. Mum inherited my old PC when I upgraded and wasted no time in getting the hang of ancestry websites where you could post messages with the names of people you were looking for, and sites where you could search for birth, death and marriage certificates and buy copies that arrived by post. This was a whole new world, but whilst Mum got very proficient at searching, helping lots of friends to find their relatives in the interim, there was nothing but dead ends for her own search. She was invited to be a guest of honour at a reunion party for a family who didn't even know they had missing siblings, until Mum joined them all up. She became incredibly skilled at finding pretty much anyone, except her own flesh and blood. Until, one day, she received a message from one of the ancestry sites. It was from a woman called Jenny in Canada, and she asked if Mum could possibly be their family's missing baby. It was a bolt from the blue and the start of the most amazing connection we could ever have imagined. Jenny's husband, John, wasn't hugely motivated to explore his family history, but Jenny had heard that his mum Susan talked about a mystery baby back in the 1930s. The story went that Susan and her husband were going to adopt her sister's baby, but that her sister died before permission could be given and the baby went for adoption elsewhere. Susan Kelly and her French-Canadian husband married and had a baby, John, Jenny's husband. They were from Leeds before they sailed to Canada, where they lived for the rest of their lives and had 2 more children, Sue and Yvette. Jenny had time on her hands, and the question mark over this missing baby from her husband's family fascinated her. The surname Kelly was the link, and it led her to finding Mum's post about Bertha Kelly on the internet. And it was Jenny's first day looking. But Susan's story and the dates didn't add up. She'd said that the baby was 2 years old and Mum was already adopted before she turned 1. Nice theory, but it didn't stack up, except everything else did. It turned out she wasn't the wrong baby, it was the wrong story. And there, on one of the few documents Mum had successfully researched, the baptism notice, was the clue, the name Susan Kelly. Susan was the witness to the baptism of Bertha's baby in Manchester, shortly before Bertha died. We may never know whether there was another baby. Mum has certainly done some searching, but what we do know for sure is that Susan Kelly was her auntie. She was there at her baptism, and that John, Sue and Yvette are her first cousins. First cousins and the first blood relatives, the first real connection and sense of belonging my mum had ever known. Mum and Yvette started a beautiful cousin connection over their computers, and recently both had their DNA tested. At the age of 79, Mum got scientific proof of who she is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We owe such a huge debt to Jenny. Her research had not only found Mum, but she'd already uncovered cousins from the original Kelly family, in Ireland, of course, which meant that now we had a whole host of family waiting to get to know the missing baby. Mum and I headed over to Ireland, and not only did we meet relatives, because they insisted on staying with them, that the farmhouse where my grandma was born was the place we stayed. My grandma, my mum's mum, was born on the farm and lived there until she went to England. Everyone welcomed Mum and I with open arms, and tears filled my eyes when we walked into the farmhouse for the first time, greeted by champagne and strawberries and the words, "Welcome home." Never was there a more important use for that phrase. Mum now truly felt a sense of belonging. She knew who she really was, a Kelly, and to top it off, she had a place to call home. The Kellys showed us photographs, graves, places and people. They threw parties and treated us like royal guests. We photographed everything, and then someone handed us a brochure celebrating 100 years of the local school. And there, in the pages, a picture taken of the pupils. The whole of the village school, infants and juniors, amounting to 30 children at most. The picture taken at the very time my grandma would have been attending that school. It only took a moment. We spotted her straight away. She looks like me. Family? Tick. Photo of her mum? Tick. Could it get any better? Just a little bit. Our Canadian cousins decided to take a trip. Ireland first and then England. And they'd be staying with us for over 10 days. I thought Mum would burst with the waiting. It was everything she might have wished for and more. John, Sue and Yvette were funny, loving and kind. They made Mum feel totally part of the family. I've never seen her so happy. And when they left, I've never seen her so sad, like they took a piece of her heart with them. The family connections continued, and now we all know about all the folks who went off to America, including Mum's cousin Maureen. Maureen is Mum's age and a total travel bug. Her daughter let me know that they were planning a trip to the UK to visit her son who was studying at Oxford, and asked if I'd like to surprise Mum by turning up in Oxford to meet them. Another first cousin to hug and share the Kelly smile with was too much to resist. I concocted a story about a work meeting in Oxford that was necessary, but so short that we could make a nice day of it, and did she want to come with me? Finally, the day came and we set off by train. By now, the secret was out. A slip on social media meant Mum knew that we were going to be meeting, there were going to be US relatives in Oxford. Although for a sweet, naive moment, she didn't realise that it wasn't just a coincidence. She said how glad she was to know in advance so she could choose what to wear. She didn't want anyone to be ashamed of her. Now, she always looks ready to meet anyone, including the Queen. It was a whirlwind, beautiful day, connecting with people who already felt like family, and the physical resemblance was uncanny. Fast forward to today, and we can only gaze back in wonder at Jenny's drive to find that missing baby. And Jenny passed away, and as her family grieve her passing, we also celebrate what a gift she brought to all of us. The gift of a loving connection to a real family. The DNA test also showed up a second cousin, one we didn't know and who didn't show up as related to our Canadian family. This seemed a little bit weird until the light dawned. If this new cousin isn't connected to the Canadians, then they must be connected to Mum's father, someone we've known nothing about. The only clue in all this searching so far that might lead to the missing piece from Mum's birth certificate, her father. Maybe there'll be a second story to write after this one. And Mum's long-held wish to one day have a photo of her mum had one last burst of magic from Maureen in America. Having lost all of her stored family history in a basement flood a few years ago, Maureen was shocked and confused one day to find something right by her computer. A photograph taken outside the front of the farmhouse in Ireland of my great-granddad and his favourite daughter, Bertha, before she went off on her adventures to England. Whoever could have guessed what that adventure would hold for all of us. Almost made it through. I hope you enjoyed the story. There's so much more to tell about my mum's story, some amazing coincidences and the most beautiful stories of all the gorgeous relatives that we've now discovered and stay connected to. We love them all, and more than anything, just knowing that my mum has connections to real people and she's not an alien after all means the absolute world. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the story, and if you fancy finding out about your family, who knows what you might find.